Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is applauded as one of the great thinkers of our times. A Bharat Ratna, a Nobel laureate for economics, a master at Trinity College, Cambridge, professor at Harvard University for economics and philosophy. He really needs no introduction. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Professor Amartya Sen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your new book, The Argumentative Indian, is an inspiring work. It seems to have this sort of great wellspring of inspiration, a great sweep of civilization. It reminded me of my sort of youthful readings of the discovery of India. What has prompted this sort of evolution, in a sense, from your writings as an economist? I should preface that by saying that it's not a subject that's really new to you, because I learned only yesterday that you had, while still a young boy, worked with your grandfather to translate and put together a book on Hinduism. But what has prompted this at this time?
Well, it's been one of my interests for a very long time, indeed. So you're quite right, Rajiv, to point out that it isn't can't claim this as a novelty in terms of my own interest. But if you're a practicing economist and engaged very much in teaching and research, as I have been, and then of course for a while when running a college, and a large college, namely Trinity, then you don't get the time to do it. So I was, oddly enough, it's during my mastership in Trinity, when I wasn't doing my regular lectures. I gave some very special lectures, mostly in mathematical economics, social choice theory. But those were not regular teaching, so I didn't have the kind of role that keeps a university teacher who is dedicated to teaching tied up. So I had time. I was Master of Trinity, I guess, from 98 to 2004. And that gave me a period when I could, from time to time, spend considerable bits of time in the library and so on.
Was it significant that you wrote this while you were at Trinity College in Cambridge? A country, a civilization, at least in contemporary times, we associate a great deal with structured argumentation, the techniques of discussion, the processes of debate, which, despite the sort of the great heritage that you talk about, that we have of this tradition in India, we seem to have lost. Argumentation, in a sense, assumes a respect for somebody else's truth. You've talked in the book extensively about the Buddhist influence and how Buddhism ruled for 100 years, and part of this was laid down by Ashoka in argumentation as a process of discourse in processes of democracy. So the question really is that in contemporary India, do you really think that argumentation in the classical sense is practiced, is achievable, or are we just quarreling?
I don't think we are, really. I think when one comments on a tradition, the claim is never that in the period in history in question, there was nothing other than those. People fought wars, killed each other. They didn't only argue. They listened to each other, but they also did nasty things to each other. So I think when any study of history involves some selection. And the intention isn't so much to say that that's all that happened, but to say that among the things that happened, these are interesting things that we ought to think about a bit. So that's the kind of claim. So I don't know that the idea of listening to each other was vastly more in ancient India than it is today. I don't really think that. But I think what is, and that's not remarkable. I mean, history has been full of dreadful events of people, doing each other in and not listening and so forth. But when there is some tradition of listening, and indeed some theorization, and that's part of my point, they all theorize about it. Ashoka is a great theorist, about how to conduct an argument. Namely, you have to listen to the other guy, then try to present your point of view without trying to deprecate or depreciate the position of the person you're arguing with. So when you get a piece of theory like that, and you see that theory quoted again and again in later period, there's reason to think that there is in it something of substance which colors the culture and so on. But the claim never is nothing else happened. People, did all kinds of things. Ashoka himself began his career by a brutal war in Orissa, in Kalinga. That, of course, had a dialectical role in moving him to Buddhism and taking him in the direction of abolishing army, banning slavery, trying to speak about individual rights and so on. So it was a very dialectically important process for him. But even in his own life, there are many things that did happen. So it really, I wouldn't take Rajiv as negative a view of contemporary traditions, as that remark may seem to suggest. But the hope is that one could do more with the argumentative tradition, our ability to listen to each other and not try to shut out arguments. But there have been indeed a tendency to shut out arguments on grounds of saying this is the Indian culture, this is the Hindu culture, and this is the Hindu country, and don't ask any questions about it. It's that which I'm resisting, questioning, doubting, and indeed disputing.
One of the sort of central themes that have emerged in your writings and in the book recently is that we mustn't take for granted the fact or the assumption that India is a Hindu civilization, and the implications of that in a globalized world, in a sense. Was it sort of writing about this, was this a response to the sort of the Hindutva discourse of recent times, that motivate you and feel that this is something that needs clarification, needs to be put out into the world?
No, I think the Hindutva thing fitted into my critique of the Hindutva thing, fitted into what had been my position on this for at least 50 years before that, in the sense that if you're interested in Indian classics, you're aware of how much heterodox thoughts there were. When I read classical Sanskrit with much greater ease than I read Vedic Sanskrit, but when I did try to read the Vedas, I was struck by the fact how many bits of heterodoxy you find in the Rig Veda in particular, also in the other Vedas, but Rig Veda too. And in my book I quote several things from Rig Veda, including what I think is a beautiful discussion about the gambler, but also the profound doubts about, did God make it? Is he there? Does he know that he made it if he did make it? Or did the universe create itself? Coming very close to ideas that contemporary astrophysicists would find good starting point to think about. No, that's 1500 BC. So if you're aware of that, and as I mentioned, I read Vedic Sanskrit with much less facility than classical Sanskrit of, say, Kalidasa or Shudrak. But I was aware of that when I was a classicist, as it were, in my school days. Sanskrit being, along with mathematics, my favorite subjects in school. But I was also aware about the role of Buddhism. Now, there's a linguistic barrier there too, because even though there's Sanskrit, quite often it's Prakrit of Pali, and which is it's not hard to follow if you know Sanskrit. It almost some way, since my own native language is Bengali, is somewhere halfway between these two languages. So I was aware of the non-Hindu heritage, Buddhism, Jainism, Lokayat, atheism, agnosticism, deep-rooted skepticism, well before the Hindutva. I've even heard the word Hindutva, I think. But then when the Hindutva movement came, there are many different things. I think it's an intolerant political position which I don't like. And I don't like for reasons that many Indian thinkers from Ashok to Akbar have made clear. So I have got that certainly in me. Not just John Stuart Mill and Rousseau and Voltaire. But the other thing is that it did seem to me there was something intellectually very shallow about reading Indian history within the prism of Hindutva, as if India, Buddhism, which was the dominant religion in India for 1,000 years, as if you can ignore it and lose nothing of interest in India's past. And this whole idea that until the Muslim conquest took place in India, India was a homogeneous Hindu country. That's just so mistaken that, quite aside from the fact that politically one should object because of the purpose to which that thesis is employed, but the first thought is not ethics or politics, but epistemology, just not correct. In terms of truth, the Indian tradition is a much wider, broader, robust, inclusive tradition.
You have talked and written about how, for example, in the Ramayana, Ram isn't exactly perceived and seen as godly, and how that the traditional texts have been interpreted and used to put forth a very Hindu interpretation of divinity, of history, of culture. Tell us about your interpretation of the Ramayana.
Yeah, I think the Ramayana is a very interesting thing to look at, because it's an epic. It has no pretension of being a religious book. Absolutely not. It's telling a story. It's telling one story, and as with Indian epics, there are tales linked with these stories, and then there are further tales linked with the tales that are linked with the principal story. And they're absolutely marvelous. I remember when I started first reading it, first the Bengali version when I was quite young, 8 or 9, and then by the time I was turning 12, 13, 14, I was trying to get into the Sanskrit version. They're absolutely marvelous epics to read.
Tell us about the divinity of Ram, because it's had
so
much significance.
But it doesn't occur to you as you read through it that you're talking of a divine character. Here's a guy who is meant to be a good king, would have been a particularly good king if he didn't give it all up and just go away. He has a lot of defects. He keeps, like many insecure men, keep worrying that Sita is not being faithful to him. It's not a thought that had not occurred to the male psyche anywhere in the world. There always this. It is a sign of insecurity. So it's a good guy, good epic hero, not a god, and with a lot of very good characteristics: just, fair, self-sacrificing, concerned with others, and yet a lot of weaknesses too. Sometimes not being fair to others because of trying to listen too much to counsels that he had good reason to ignore. And so you end up with it's a rich human character rather than a god. So I think for me initially, and to some extent there is a cultural divide here, Rama traditionally is closer to being a god, but not really in Tulsidas, than he is in Krittivas, in the Bengali translation. And similarly, Hanuman in Bengali versions is a funny, lovable character. In fact, if you think of the traditional plays, the yatras or jatras as we call it in Bengal, Hanuman is always the comic relief. It plays the same part as comic relief do in Western drama, sometimes with some wisdom like Falstaff, but sometimes without that. But he comes in and he messes everything up, and the tale might upset the stage arrangement, etc. So it's a kind of, it's a story, and it would be very difficult for in a Bengali culture to see Hanuman as a divine character. And that is to some extent a divide between Bengal and North India. Actually, and if one is going to be classical, it's really a distinction between the Sauraseni part of the Sanskrit tradition as opposed to the Magadhi and the Bengal, of course, in the other Magadhi direction. So it's a split that occurs somewhat earlier than Bengali really emerges. But it's quite ingrained, and the Oriya, the Assamese, the Bengali, that bit that came out of the Ardha Magadhi group, that group has a kind of skepticism about Hanuman. And Ram, by and large, is still a character of an epic hero.
We were talking about sort of India's claimed Hindu heritage. What is it in our traditions that give us our sense of secularism? You've described Indian secularism as being a lot more vibrant and a lot more festive in a sense than the austere secularism of the West. You've pointed out that it was Akbar who really formulated this position of the state being equidistant from...
Yeah. Well, to be fair, of course, Ashok did first that. I think the priority goes to Ashok, because in fact, if you think about Ashoka's problems, they're quite considerable. He's a Buddhist, a convert Buddhist, and and if you convert to a position, then you have a much greater zeal in spreading it than if you just happen to be born into it. So he is doing a lot to spread Buddhism in the world, and yet he wants also the state not to be unfair to other religions, so that he's doing both a kind of intense religious conviction of his own, combined with religious tolerance of other faiths, and finds a way of dealing with it by rules for public engagement, public discussion, and the need for listening to each other. So I think that occurs, and then a number of people have tried to follow that rule, but Akbar is the one who theorized about it, and it's somewhat odd because unlike Ashoka, because Akbar was basically illiterate, but he had in his court Abul Fazl, who is one of the great scholars really, both in Persian and Arabic on one side and Sanskrit on the other. And Abul Fazl, it is to him that we owe Akbar's theorizing understanding. And so he is also very clear on that. But aside from, you're right, Rajiv, that there's something festive about this secularism, but there's also something of a rather different kind from European secularism, which has tended to concentrate much more in a kind of witch hunt of whether there's any religious connection in any state activity, jumping at it and eliminating it, like the headscarves in the French schools. State school, how the hell can you wear a headscarf? I think Ashoka's position and Akbar's would have been, that's all right, as long as people of other religious communities can wear what they like, that the Sikhs could wear their turbans, and if Hindus want to wear a particular thing, fine. And similarly, if Jews, and there have been Jews in India, as you know, from 1st century AD, if they want to put in some Jewish headgear, that's fine too. So if you take that view, it's focusing not on in kind of banning things, but allowing people their own way of expressing, and even though you don't want to follow their practice, you view them with respect because it's the faith of somebody else.
So what you see are the sort of the real challenges to Indian secularism?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, because you see that idea, it happened to come from a Buddhist, but in fact it's very ingrained in Indian tradition. I see it in the Vedas, I see it in the Upanishads, I see it in the epics, and in between comes Buddha, nicely poised between the Vedic and Vedanta period and the epic period. And Ashoka is the theorist of it. But that is an Indian tradition, and in some ways, without being exclusively Hindu tradition, it's part of the Hindu tradition too. But what I regard is really objectionable is the miniaturization of India. This is a robust, broad, a great idea, a spacious, capacious idea. And suddenly you are told, no, 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 none of that. We believe in whatever it is, that Ram was born, whatever it is, in this spot, and he was God, and anyone who denies it is telling a lie, and Hanuman was divine too, no matter what the Bengali jatras may portray him as, and you suddenly, you take a kind of rather profound adventure in ideas and thought and understanding and tolerance, and convert it into a very raw creed. So it's the cultivation of a particularly raw version of what is taken to be Hinduism, combined with that being the Indian tradition. Nothing else is as important as that. That, I think, downsizes India so badly that as an Indian, I really don't like it. And indeed, I don't have strong religious conviction, in fact, never had that, excepting insofar as I have any. I've been an atheist, which, as my grandfather, who wrote the Penguin Hinduism, which is probably the most successful English book ever on Hinduism, as he said when I told him that I was not really religious and I was an atheist, he said, no, no, that's not the case. You have examined the religious question, and I see you have placed yourself in the lokayat, atheistic part of the Hindu spectrum. So in that sense, I remain a Hindu, though an atheist. But so I do object to the downsizing, miniaturization of Hinduism itself. It had room for Charvak. It had room for Shankara. It also had room for Yajnavalkya in the Upanishads, and it had room for whoever were involved in the composition of the Vedas. And it's that capacious, broad, liberal idea of Hinduism, which I think is under a tremendous stress now. So I object both to the intolerance and also the kind of intellectual downgrading of India from a rather profound civilization to one which is concerned with the divinity of cows and drinking cows' urine and running around trying to declare the divinity of human beings. I mean, it is really not one notch down. It's like 165 notches down. And as a proud Indian, I'm really upset. It's undermining my culture.
The other sort of dimension that you have written about and celebrated is Indian democracy. You've talked about the imperative of public reasoning, going beyond the mere ballot box. You've talked about how Indian democracy wasn't just sort of the West's gift to India, but has been a very integral part of our heritage and tradition. How do you locate Indian democracy today, despite all the criticisms, the fears, the concerns of the threats to it?
I think Indian democracy has done reasonably well. I mean, there are a lot of imperfections, but the basic idea of democracy, which is the importance of public reasoning, guaranteeing it, which requires the freedom of the press, the media in general. It requires opposition, people being able to criticize each other, and reflecting the views of people as it emerges through public reasoning in decisions. And that requires voting. Polling, balloting, fits into a broader picture of government by discussion, of public reasoning being the central thing in democracy. I think by and large we have done well on that. There have been lapses, and sometimes the lapses have been corrected. For example, the emergency was a lapse. The Indian electorate, I think, quickly corrected it. I think the trying to silence minorities in Gujarat, and I'm afraid no matter what finesse is put in it and how much, what interpretation is put as to what happened in the fire in Godhra, in the train, the fact is, and that train issue remains a separate one. The fact is that there was a terrorization of minorities. The minorities came dreadfully terrorized, and that is that's a violation of democracy. You can't have public reasoning if people are afraid of their lives, and not to mention they're unable to participate in political processes. But again, the Indian electorate corrected it in the sense that the architects of that may have done not as badly in Gujarat as elsewhere, but worse than they did in the past. But in India, the governance went to a different hand. Vajpayee, who the previous prime minister, did say that the Gujarat bloodbath was one of the main factors responsible for losing the election. He was immediately sat upon by his party members, other party leaders for having said that. But I think there was a lot of truth in what he was saying. So I think Indian democracy have guarded that well. I think where we haven't done so well is making enough use of the public reasoning tradition to deal with the problems that we have, the inequalities related to class, the rich and poor, the caste divisions, and inequalities of gender. I think that more has happened on the gender side than had been true 50 years ago when I first started writing about the dreadful position of Indian women. I think it was treated as a kind of eccentricity on my part, because that wasn't even the left didn't. They were very much more concerned with class. Gender didn't seem to fit into it. That's no longer true.
You've written about how Sarojini Naidu was the first leader of a political party anywhere
in the world.
In the world.
Yeah, I think this is the duality of India, because you see, there is this tradition of women's articulation, which I also discuss in the book Maitreyi and Gargi, and there is a kind of, even in ancient India, tradition of women being articulate, taking a leadership role. And that was reflected already. If Indian women were neglected, the high mortality rate of girls compared with boys, that coexisted with women in prominent position. There were more women leaders in the Indian national movement led by Congress than there were in the Chinese and Russian revolutionary movement put together.
Talking about the Chinese and the Russians, you've also written about how, when India became a democracy, it was sort of the first developing country to embrace democracy, and a lot of people have, said and expressed concern that democracy has inhibited India's progress and development. You've argued against it, particularly in comparison to China.
But I think that's that point of view, I think is absolutely, it's an understatement to say I've argued against it. I think it's unmitigated nonsense, because there's nothing, the whole idea that economic growth was somehow inhibited by democracy, what I always thought was a very silly thing. We were making a lot of mistakes in our economic policies, but the basic idea that those who I was disagreeing with were putting forward, that growth required not friendliness of the economic climate, but the fierceness of the political regime, was actually profoundly mistaken. There was no evidence for it, and there was no reasoning behind it. And now that India is doing pretty well in terms of economic growth, it can improve it a lot, and certainly those issues of inequality we were just now discussing are important ones to address, and it played a part also in the demise of the previous government. Those remain important, but as far as economic growth is concerned, India is doing, just on those terms, reasonably well for 2 decades now. You would have thought people would go away saying, no, we were mistaken in saying economic growth requires dictatorship, and India could never have high economic growth because it's a democracy. They don't say that. They now shift the goalposts and move the argument in a different direction. But as I discuss in my book, even if you judge in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, and so on, the gap between China and India has dramatically gone down. And I think China is paying a heavy price for not having a democratic system. The Chinese did a lot of things exactly right, and it's often forgotten that when the Chinese Communist Party came into office, it came in as a popular democratic movement. They were trying to replace a classist regime of KMT, by a more popular democratic regime. And the success in schooling and healthcare that happened there, as it happened in Cuba, where also they came in the democratic movement, or Vietnam or Russia, had similarity. But then you pay a penalty if from that point onward there is no further democracy. You ban opposition and you make the media completely controlled. And if the Chinese life expectancy progress had become more sluggish, if the infant mortality, the rate is, 1979 at the time of economic reform, China and Kerala had the same infant mortality rate, 37 per thousand. Now Kerala has 10, whereas China has 30. And I think Chinese are paying quite a heavy price for not having a democratic system. So indeed, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think there are lots of things for us to learn from China.
Yesterday,
but democracy, lack of democracy is not one of them.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister, while in releasing the book, and we record this on the day after the event, talked about India's emerging place in the Comity of Nations, and how the articulations in your book make this great contribution on an understanding of India's place in the world. What is India's place in the world? What role?
Yeah, that is the kind of question which I would leave the Prime Minister to address, because I'm really this is the book on history, culture, and identity, as the subtitle says, of India. I'm concerned with that.
But it evokes a sense of pride in India, in India's contribution to universal civilization.
I think there are two reasons behind my stating it. I think there are a lot of things in which Indians have good reason to take pride in, which they don't. I think the reason to take pride in isn't that we were the first country to recognize that cows are holy. That's not where the reason for our pride lies. And if those who go around that as on their flagship and showing the Indian culture is great, we recognize the holiness of this animal very early, I think they do a great disservice to the intellectual tradition of India. And I think it's quite important, not only for people in India, but also the 20 million or so diaspora which exist in the world. Diasporas are often very important because they're very active, they're away from home, and they want to take pride. They provide a lot of money with every separatist movement, every extremist movement, whether it's Sikh extremism or Hindu extremism, not to mention Islamic fundamentalism, gets a lot of contribution from the diaspora. And it's very important for the diaspora not only to have the understandable desire to take some pride in India, but to understand what to take pride in. So that's part of the problem. But the other is purely personal, that I do have a reading of understanding of India, which over the years I spent some time trying to examine, scrutinize, criticize, and come to some kind of equilibrium with. And the book is an attempt to share it. And the question which you asked, which Manmohan, the Prime Minister, addressed, namely India's place in the world, I'm not directly concerned with the book, but if Manmohan thinks that the view of India that I present might help to understand why India may be a big player in the game in the world, a question that I don't address, that is his analysis. I'm pleased if he thinks that. That's not part of my thesis.
What is your aspiration for India? You obviously, retain a great sense of Indianness. You retained your passport. You travel and visit India frequently. There's a confidence about you, about your Indian identity, your Indianness. What is your aspiration for India, 15, 20, 30, whatever years, in the unfolding of time?
Well, I think there's not one really. I think there are many things. I hope we retain our pluralism. I hope we retain our democracy, make the practice of democracy much better. I hope we make greater progress than we have made on gender equity. I think class divisions are tremendously underestimated. My friend Sudhir Mulji, who alas recently died, when I was giving a lecture called Class in India, a Nehru lecture, that's actually slightly modified form included in the book. He told me that you've forgotten, Amartya told Sudhir, is actually his own political view, where of the right rather than left, saying that it's no longer fashionable to talk about class in India, and I'm afraid he's right. He was right. It is actually a big part of Indian reality. I'd like to see much greater engagement on the tremendous problems that come from class divisions, and the people who have difficulty about knowing how to feed their kids well. People have difficulty about teaching their children, sending them to school and college, if they're lucky enough to get there. People who, if they're picked up by the police, are treated like dirt rather than with the respect in which, if you and I were picked up, will be treated. I think they often belong to the same part of the class spectrum, and we have to engage that issue. So I think these are the programs to deal with.
Is there a personal aspiration that you have for yourself, or is it so deeply wedded to the larger aspiration of the ideas that you have put out into the world coming to fruition? In a sense, for a lot of people, the history of modern India started with independence. How do you think India has fared since independence?
Well, I think a mixed scorecard, I would say. I think the fact that the resolution to have the first democratic polity among the poor countries in the world, the first one in Asia and Africa, I think that has been, by and large, a success. Democracy has taken strong roots in India, and indeed it had roots earlier in the long tradition of public reasoning that we have had in India. I think in terms of dealing with the barriers of class, the division between the rich and poor, and gender, women and men, and caste, and other things that make Indian society so divided, with the fortunes of some being so disparately worse than the fortunes of others.
Is that the welfare economist in you asserting itself?
No, I think it's a human being in me. I think welfare economics is a technical subject, and it has its role. One doesn't have to be particularly technical to see that if all human beings living in a society have extremely disparate deals, some people, because of being women or because of being lower class, because of coming from a low-down caste, have a dreadfully worse prospect than others, that there's something wrong. I don't think we need welfare economics for that. I think we need a little bit of human thinking on this.
Are you excited by the impact of the new economic initiatives, policies of Manmohan Singh and the government?
Well, Manmohan, of course, had been trying to do something from the first round in '92 when he came in. Yeah, my position then was that Manmohan was absolutely right in going towards economic reform. We had to change the license, Raj. But I was somewhat disappointed, and Manmohan knows that we didn't spend as much effort in trying to expand education, basic health, and infrastructure, and so on. Now, in the present round, these are very early days. He was elected only a year ago. These seem to be part of the focus. Indeed, he has emphasized them every time he has spoken on that subject. So I'm looking out on that. Certainly, the rhetoric and the presentation, and I believe, since I know Manmohan and admire him greatly, and I know that he is very keen on doing things that he says he wants to do, I'm very pleased that what he is emphasizing today is something which I personally happy about, much closer to what I would have liked him to say then, and I think he, in '92. And I mean, that was a very important period too. I think Manmohan did something radically important to change the nature of the Indian economy. But I think his present program, with its focus on other things, is very, very strong, and I think the prospects are great. We have to see how the carrying out of the project would be.
You have sort of so eloquently and in so much detail analyzed the functionings of Indian democracy. Why is it that sort of things that you talk about and feel so passionately about, health, education, and issues like that, don't come center stage and come up front in the electoral process?
Well, I think I agree. I think that is, to some extent, if I may say, your failure. That is the media's failure. Namely, I think the media often don't succeed in emphasizing so much. I think the story about the Ratha Yatra it becomes more dominant in that story, rather than the fact that hundreds of millions are not going to school or not having education of the kind that they ought to have. So I think it's democracy is an opportunity, and it depends much on what we do with the opportunity. And I think not just the media, but media importantly too, but the political leadership, the people who are involved in thinking about the future of India, from academics, literary people who write fiction.
Wouldn't you expect a demand pull from the electorate saying, give us hospitals, give us schools?
Well, there is demand pull, but it's a question of how you translate that in the form of political articulation. Demands are always there. I mean, if you have spent a lot of time, as I have, say 15 years, studying famine, demands often come in a kind of very mild way. The Irish famine in 1840s, which killed a higher proportion of the people than in any other famine that I believe existed in the world, were periods of peace and quiet. Not anything against law and order happened in Ireland, but for 150 years or more after that, the memory of that fed disaffection and violence coming from Ireland. So that it's not the case that people suffering most are invariably the easiest position to be more articulate. That's where politics comes in. The role of political leadership, the role of political engagement, the role of political dialectics is to bring out these things. So I don't see it as a failure of the people who themselves are the most sufferers. Obviously they have a big role in that, but it's a question of getting it more ingrained in Indian politics, the demands of the underdogs of society. I think that's a very important commitment for the media, for the academics, for the writers, fiction, non-fiction, everything, than it has succeeded in being so far. I don't know what the personal ambition is. I'm mainly an academic. I like teaching. I like researching, and as long as I have my strength, I would quite like to go on teaching and researching, which I really enjoy, and being in touch with younger people who happen to be often my students or interlocutors in discussion. That's great fun. I don't think I have any great public, great ambition personally beyond that. But for the country, I do have a lot of hope, and both of a protective kind, including our democracy, pluralism, tolerance, and respect. It's not just tolerance, but also getting over the real barriers of class, gender, and caste. And I think it's possible for us to go much farther ahead.
Sen, thank you very much. This has been a great privilege, sir.
Thank you.